Camp Concordia, Kansas, February 1945. The wind carried dust across the flatlands like a persistent memory, scratching against the wooden barracks that housed 4,000 German prisoners of war. The camp stretched across the Kansas prairie like a scar, watchtowers piercing the horizon, barbed wire glinting in the weak winter sun, and rows upon rows of identical structures that had become home to men who never imagined America would be their prison. Ernst Müller stood by the window of Barracks 12, his breath fogging the glass as he stared at nothing. 23 years old, though his eyes belonged to someone who had lived twice that long. The Luftwaffe uniform he'd worn with pride now hung in a locker somewhere in processing, replaced by the denim work clothes that marked him as property of the United States War Department. His hands, once steady on the controls of a Messerschmitt Bf 109, now trembled from cold and idleness. Behind him, men played cards with worn decks, wrote letters that may never reach home, and argued about a war that continued without them. The barracks smelled of cigarette smoke, unwashed wool, and the peculiar desperation of men caught between worlds, no longer soldiers, not yet free, unsure if home even existed anymore. "They say Dresden is gone," someone muttered in German, "burned to ash." Ernst closed his eyes. His sister lived in Dresden. Lived, past tense perhaps. The afternoon stretched like a sentence with no punctuation, one moment bleeding into the next without meaning or purpose. This was the hardest part of captivity, not the confinement, not the rations, not even the defeat. It was the silence, the absence of purpose, the slow dissolution of identity when a man has nothing to fight for and nowhere to fight. That's when they heard it. At first, it was just a distant crackle, static riding the wind from somewhere beyond the fence. Then came a sound so foreign, so utterly unexpected, that every conversation in Barracks 12 died mid-sentence. Music, but not the martial marches they'd grown up with, not the Wagner or Beethoven that had accompanied their youth, not even the sentimental folk songs their mothers had sung. This was something else entirely, a wild, unrestrained trumpet that seemed to laugh and cry simultaneously, backed by a rhythm that had no rigid structure, no predictable pattern, no discipline. Jazz. Ernst moved to the door, drawn by the sound like a moth to flame. Other prisoners emerged from barracks across the compound, faces etched with confusion and curiosity. They stood in the cold, hundreds of them, listening to music that defied everything they'd been taught about order, control, and the proper way things should sound. The music came from the maintenance shed near the south fence, where Marcus Jefferson worked. Marcus was 58 years old, a custodian who'd cleaned the camp's administrative buildings and repaired what needed repairing since Concordia opened in 1943. He was also the only black employee the prisoners regularly saw, and most had never spoken to him beyond necessary work exchanges. What they didn't know, what they couldn't have known, was that Marcus Jefferson had played trumpet in Kansas City during the 1920s, before the Depression crushed dreams like empty tin cans. He'd shared stages with Count Basie before Basie was Count Basie, had felt the electric thrill of improvisation in basement clubs where music flowed like bootleg whiskey, dangerous, intoxicating, free. His radio sat on a workbench surrounded by tools, its tubes warming up as it caught the signal from WDAF in Kansas City. And on that February afternoon, during a rare broadcast of recorded jazz from before the war, Marcus had turned the volume up, not to make a statement, not to educate or provoke, simply because he missed it, the sound of freedom, the sound of home, the sound of a life he'd once lived. Louis Armstrong's trumpet filled the air, playing West End blues with such raw emotion that it seemed impossible one instrument could contain that much humanity. The opening cadenza soared and dipped, laughed and mourned, told stories without words about joy and suffering, and the stubborn insistence on beauty despite it all. Ernst stood frozen, his mind struggling to process what his ears reported. This music broke rules he didn't even know existed. It bent notes that should have been straight, found rhythms in spaces that should have been empty, created harmony from what sounded like chaos, but somehow worked, somehow made perfect sense in its complete disregard for sense. "What is this?" whispered Hans Richter, a former tank commander who stood beside Ernst, his face slack with wonder. "I don't know," Ernst replied. "American music, I think. It sounds wrong, but also, I know." Around them, other prisoners struggled to articulate the same contradiction. This wasn't the degenerate noise their teachers and leaders had warned them about, or rather, it was. But the degeneracy contained something vital and alive that their approved music had somehow lacked. It was uncontrolled, yes, but not mindless, chaotic, but not confused. It was human in a way that transcended language, culture, and the brutal circumstances that had brought them here. Captain Howard Mitchell, the camp's deputy commander, emerged from the administration building, drawn by the unusual silence. He expected trouble. Prisoners gathering always meant trouble, but instead found hundreds of German POWs standing motionless in the cold, their faces turned toward the maintenance shed like sunflowers seeking light. Marcus hadn't noticed his audience. He sat on a stool, eyes closed, fingers tapping the rhythm on his knee, transported back to rooms thick with smoke and possibility, when he was young and the horn in his hands could make people forget their troubles for 3 minutes and 28 seconds. The song ended. The radio announcer's voice crackled through, introducing the next piece, Duke Ellington's Mood Indigo, with its melancholy brass and blue-tinged piano that painted loneliness in sound. Captain Mitchell walked slowly toward the shed, not to stop the music, but to understand this strange tableau. He'd spent 2 years managing German prisoners, had seen them angry, defiant, resigned, and broken, but never this, never transfixed, never transformed by something as simple as a radio playing jazz. Ernst felt something crack inside his chest, a wall he'd built from duty and necessity and the need to survive. The music wormed through defenses constructed over years of war, found places he'd forgotten existed, reminded him that before he was a soldier, before he was a prisoner, before he was a defeated enemy of a nation he'd never wanted to fight, he was human. And humans needed more than bread and water and orders. They needed beauty. They needed surprise. They needed proof that the world contained more than ash and blood and the mechanical grinding of ideology against ideology until nothing remained but rubble and grief. "Gentlemen," Captain Mitchell called out in German, his voice cutting through the music, "return to your barracks." No one moved. "That's an order." Still they stood. Not in defiance, there was no aggression in their posture, no challenge in their eyes. They simply couldn't move yet, couldn't break whatever spell the music had cast, couldn't return to the gray routine of captivity without taking this moment as far as it would go. Mitchell understood. He'd fought in North Africa, had seen enough death and waste to know that sometimes mercy meant letting men steal moments of grace wherever they found them. He nodded slowly and walked back toward the administration building, leaving them to their discovery. Marcus finally opened his eyes and saw his audience. He froze, hand halfway to the radio dial, suddenly aware that his private moment had become public, that these enemy soldiers, men who'd fought for a regime that considered people like him subhuman, stood listening to his music with expressions he couldn't quite read. Their eyes met across 50 yards of winter air and barbed wire and the unbridgeable gulf of history. Marcus had every reason to hate these men. His nephew had died at Normandy, cut down by German machine guns before his 19th birthday. His sister still wore black. And yet, and yet he saw in their faces the same thing he'd seen in jazz clubs across Kansas City, people hungry for something that transcended their circumstances, desperate for beauty in an ugly world, willing to be changed by sound. He didn't turn the radio off. The music played on. That evening Ernst couldn't sleep. He lay in his bunk, staring at the ceiling boards, watching shadows shift as men moved below him. The barracks had settled into its nightly routine, snoring, whispered conversations, the occasional sob from someone who thought darkness hid his tears. But Ernst's mind replayed the music, trying to capture notes that refused to be captured, rhythms that slipped away like water through fingers. He'd studied music in gymnasium, could read Bach and Mozart, understood the mathematics of composition. This jazz was different. It lived in the spaces between notes, in the unexpected, in the permission to make mistakes and call them innovations. "You're awake," Hans said from the bunk below. "Yes." "Me too, thinking about the music." Ernst smiled in the darkness. "Also me." "Do you know what it reminded me of?" Hans's voice carried a strange quality, thoughtful, almost wondering. Freedom. Not the freedom to do as you please, but the freedom to be uncertain, to improvise, to not know what comes next and trust that you'll figure it out. "We were never allowed that," Ernst said quietly. "Everything was always planned, every step choreographed, every note in its proper place." "Yes, and look where it brought us." The silence that followed contained worlds, the death of certainty, the collapse of systems that had promised order and delivered only chaos, the slow recognition that maybe the degeneracy they'd been warned about was actually vitality, and what they'd called strength was simply rigidity, waiting to shatter. "My sister loved music," Ernst said suddenly. "She played piano. Brahms, mostly. Very proper, very correct." He paused. "I wonder if she ever heard anything like what we heard today." Hans didn't ask about the past tense. They all had ghosts. "If she did," Hans said carefully, "I bet she would have loved it." Ernst hoped that was true. He hoped Dresden had left some music standing, that somewhere in the ruins there was still room for sounds that couldn't be controlled or contained or bent to serve ideology. He hoped his sister had heard jazz before the bombs fell, had felt what he felt today, that sudden expansion of possibility, that reminder that human beings were capable of more than following orders and marching in straight lines. The next morning, something had shifted. It wasn't dramatic. The camp looked the same. The routine proceeded as always. Roll call, work assignments, meals, the slow erosion of hours into days, into weeks. But Ernst noticed small changes. Men hummed melodies that didn't come from German songbooks. Conversations turned to music, to what they'd heard, to what it meant. At the work detail that afternoon, clearing snow from the camp roads, Ernst found himself assigned near the maintenance shed. Marcus was there, repairing a fence post, his radio silent beside him. They worked in proximity for 20 minutes before Ernst gathered courage. "Excuse me," he said in careful English. "Yesterday, the music." "What was it called?" Marcus looked up, studying this young German with ancient eyes that had seen too much of human nature to be easily surprised. "Jazz," he said simply. "American jazz. You liked it?" I don't know. It confused me, but I couldn't stop listening." A smile played at the corner of Marcus's mouth. "That's jazz, son. It confuses everyone the first time, but it gets in your blood, makes you feel alive in ways you didn't know you were dead." Ernst considered this. "In Germany, we were told it was not good music, degenerate." "Degenerate?" Marcus tasted the word like something bitter. Funny how people call things degenerate when they really mean makes me feel something I wasn't supposed to feel. He paused. "Jazz is about freedom. Freedom to express yourself, to be sad or happy or angry or confused, all in one song. Freedom to make mistakes and turn them into something beautiful. That's scary for people who want control." "I'm beginning to understand that," Ernst said quietly. They worked in silence for a while, the sound of hammers and shovels providing percussion to their thoughts. Then Marcus did something unexpected. He reached over to his radio and turned it on, keeping the volume low enough that only they could hear. Billie Holiday's voice emerged, singing "Strange Fruit" with such devastating emotion that Ernst felt his throat tighten. He didn't understand all the English words, but he understood the pain, the accusation, the refusal to look away from horror. This was war in music form, not the glory and heroism they'd been promised, but the ugly truth of what humans did to each other when hate was given permission. "That's about lynching," Marcus said softly. "About black folks in the South hung from trees like strange fruit. My uncle, 1919, Georgia." Ernst stopped working. "I'm sorry." "Yeah." Marcus's voice was flat, emotionless in a way that contained all emotions. "Me too. But that's what jazz does. It tells the truth. It don't pretty things up. It says, this is what it is, this is what we feel, and we're going to make something beautiful anyway, because beauty is how we survive." Ernst understood. He thought of Dresden, of Cologne, of Berlin, of cities turned to ash and people turned to statistics, of a war fought in the name of greatness that had produced only grief. And somehow, in this moment, listening to a black custodian explain jazz while standing in a prisoner of war camp in Kansas, Ernst felt closer to truth than he had in years. "Could you—" Ernst hesitated. "Could you play more, not just for me, for all of us?" Marcus studied him. "You asking me to educate German prisoners on jazz music? I'm asking you to share something beautiful with people who forgot beauty existed." The older man considered this, his weathered face unreadable. Then he nodded slowly. "I'll talk to Captain Mitchell. No promises. But maybe." Captain Mitchell sat in his office that evening reading Ernst's request, written in careful English on a scrap of paper Marcus had delivered. "Dear Captain Mitchell, we, the prisoners of Barracks 12, request permission for music education. We heard American jazz and would like to learn more about this music and the culture it comes from. We believe understanding America includes understanding American music. We promise respectful behavior and gratitude for this opportunity. Respectfully, Ernst Müller, former Lieutenant Luftwaffe." Mitchell leaned back in his chair, cigarette smoke curling toward the ceiling. This was unusual. In 2 years running POW camps, he'd received requests for extra food, better work assignments, news from home, religious services. Never music lessons, never jazz. He thought about the war, which was clearly ending now, even if it wasn't officially over. He thought about what would come after, when these men went home to a Germany that would need rebuilding not just in brick and stone, but in spirit and soul. He thought about the kind of Germany that might emerge if its people learned that freedom could be beautiful, that chaos could be creative, that different didn't mean degenerate. He thought about Marcus Jefferson, a man who'd served this camp with quiet dignity, despite working for a nation that didn't always serve him with equal dignity in return. He thought about giving Marcus this small platform, this acknowledgement that his culture had value worth teaching even to former enemies. But mostly he thought about mercy, about the fact that these men, whatever they'd done or believed or fought for, were still human beings who responded to beauty like all human beings do, with wonder and hunger, and the desperate hope that the world contained more than violence. He stubbed out his cigarette and picked up his pen. Request approved. 1 hour, Saturday afternoons, maintenance shed. Marcus Jefferson will supervise. Educational purposes only. First session this Saturday. Saturday arrived cold and clear. 50 German prisoners crowded into and around the maintenance shed, their breath fogging the air as they waited. Ernst stood in front, nervous and excited in equal measure. Hans beside him. Others from their barracks and from across the camp. Word had spread, and men hungry for anything different from the routine had come to see what this was about. Marcus arrived carrying a battered trumpet case. He set it on the workbench, looked at the assembled faces, and spoke in English that Ernst translated quietly for those who needed it. "Gentlemen," Marcus began, "I'm not a teacher. I'm a janitor who used to play trumpet in clubs you've never heard of in a city you'll never visit. But you want to know about jazz, so I'll tell you what I know." He opened the trumpet case. The instrument inside was old, dented, the brass worn from thousands of hours of playing. But when Marcus lifted it to his lips, it shone. Jazz started in New Orleans, down in Louisiana, started with black folks who'd been slaves, who'd been freed but not really free, you understand? Started in churches and funeral marches and Saturday night dances. Started with people taking European instruments and African rhythms and the blues and field hollers and mixing it all together into something new. He played a few notes, slow, mournful, bending the pitch in ways that made the trumpet sound almost human. See that? That's a blue note. It's not exactly on the scale you learned in school. It's in between, in the crack, in the place where the rules don't quite reach. That's where jazz lives, in the cracks. Ernst listened, mesmerized. Marcus explained call and response, improvisation, swing rhythm, the 12-bar blues. He played examples, his old trumpet singing stories of joy and sorrow, Saturday night and Sunday morning, dancing and mourning, and everything human beings felt but couldn't quite say in words. "The most important thing about jazz," Marcus said, lowering his trumpet, "is that it's a conversation. One musician plays something, another responds. You listen to each other, you build on what came before, you take chances. You might fail, but you try anyway because the trying is the point." "It's like democracy," Hans said suddenly, and Ernst translated. Marcus smiled. "Yeah, son, it's exactly like democracy. Everyone gets a voice. You take turns. You disagree sometimes, but you make something together that no one could make alone. That's jazz. That's America at its best. Not always what America is, but what it's trying to be." The prisoners absorbed this, processing the idea that music could be political without being propaganda, that freedom could be structured without being rigid, that chaos and beauty could coexist. "Now," Marcus said, "I'm going to play you something, and I want you to really listen, not with your heads trying to analyze it, with your hearts. Just feel it. Let it take you wherever it takes you." He lifted the trumpet again and played his own improvisation on "What a Wonderful World," a song that wouldn't be written for another 20 years. But the emotion was already there, the longing for beauty in a world that often wasn't beautiful at all. The notes floated across the cold afternoon air, carrying with them all the complexity of human existence, pain and hope, loss and resilience, the stubborn insistence that, despite everything, despite all the evidence to the contrary, life was still worth living, beauty still worth creating, and tomorrow might yet be better than today. Ernst closed his eyes and let the music in. He thought about his sister in Dresden, about his parents in Munich, about the Messerschmitt he'd flown, and the men he'd killed, and the girl he'd loved who probably didn't wait for him. He thought about the years of certainty that had collapsed into years of doubt. He thought about home, not the nation he'd fought for, but the smaller, truer home of his mother's kitchen, and his father's study and Sunday dinners when the world was smaller, and he was young, and everything seemed possible. And he thought maybe, just maybe, it was possible again. Not the same possibilities. Those were gone, burned in the fires of a war that never should have been fought. But new possibilities, uncertain possibilities, jazz possibilities that lived in the cracks between what was and what might be. When Marcus finished playing, nobody spoke. The silence held for a long moment, filled with everything words couldn't carry. Then, slowly, the prisoners began to applaud, not the sharp military applause they'd been trained to give, but the genuine human sound of gratitude for something that had touched them in places they'd forgotten could be touched. Marcus nodded, embarrassed and pleased. "That's all I got for today, gentlemen. Same time next week, if the captain allows it." As the prisoners filed out, Ernst approached Marcus. "Thank you," he said in English. "You gave us something today, something important." "What's that, son?" Ernst searched for the right words. "Hope," he said finally. "Not hope that the war ends differently or that we go home soon. Hope that we can still feel things, that we're still human, that there's still music in the world, even after everything." Marcus looked at this young German, this enemy soldier, this prisoner, this fellow human being trying to find his way back to himself, and nodded. "That's what jazz does, Ernst. It reminds us we're alive. And as long as we're alive, we can change, we can grow, we can become something different than what we were." He paused. "The war taught you how to die. Jazz can teach you how to live." That night, Ernst wrote a letter home. He didn't know if it would reach anyone. Dresden might be gone. His family might be dead. The postal system might be chaos. But he wrote anyway because that's what humans do. We reach out into the darkness and hope someone reaches back. "Dear Mother and Father, today I heard music unlike anything we knew in Germany. American jazz, they call it. It's wild and undisciplined and beautiful in ways I cannot explain. It made me think of home, not the Germany we fought for, but the Germany of Christmas markets and summer evenings, and the sound of your voices calling me in for dinner. I don't know what will be left when I return. I don't know what Germany will be, or who I will be when I see it again. But today, listening to an old black man play trumpet in a prisoner of war camp in America, I remembered that beauty still exists, that humans can still create things that matter, that maybe we can build something better from the ashes. I hope you hear jazz someday. I hope it confuses and moves you the way it moved me. I hope it reminds you, as it reminded me, that the future doesn't have to sound like the past. With love, Ernst." He folded the letter, addressed it to Dresden, and placed it in the outgoing mailbox. It would probably never arrive. That was fine. He'd written it as much for himself as for them, a declaration that he was still capable of hope, still willing to believe in beauty, still human enough to imagine a different kind of world. Outside, the Kansas wind howled across the prairie, carrying with it the ghost of trumpet notes and the promise of spring. The war would end soon. They would go home to whatever home remained. They would rebuild what could be rebuilt and mourn what couldn't be saved. But they would remember this moment, when a Custodian's radio played jazz and time stopped, and German prisoners of war stood frozen in the cold, stunned by a sound they'd never heard before, a sound that whispered radical truths about freedom and beauty and the indestructible resilience of the human spirit. They would remember, and in remembering, they would carry jazz back with them. Not the music itself, necessarily, but the idea of it, the permission it granted to improvise, to feel, to create beauty from chaos, to find harmony in dissonance, to swing instead of march. That was Marcus Jefferson's real gift that winter afternoon in Kansas. Not music lessons, not cultural education, but liberation of a different kind. The freedom to be uncertain, to change, to become something other than what they'd been told they must be. The freedom to be human in all its complicated, contradictory, beautiful chaos. The freedom that jazz had always promised to anyone brave enough to listen. Camp Concordia operated from 1943 to 1945, housing over 4,000 German POWs in rural Kansas. While this specific story is dramatized, the broader truth remains. Many German prisoners encountered American culture, including jazz, for the first time during their captivity. And these experiences profoundly shaped their understanding of democracy, freedom, and cultural diversity. Jazz, born from African American communities in the early 20th century, represented everything the Nazi regime feared: racial mixing, improvisation, individual expression, and the beautiful chaos of democracy in action, For young Germans raised under totalitarianism, hearing jazz for the first time was often a revelation, not just musically but philosophically. Many former POWs returned to Germany with changed perspectives, having encountered American ideals not through propaganda but through daily interactions, cultural exposure, and the quiet dignity of people like the Marcus Jeffersons of America, individuals who maintained their humanity and generosity even toward enemies. Music, it turns out, can be as powerful as any weapon in changing hearts and minds. And sometimes the most revolutionary act is simply playing a trumpet in a place where beauty isn't expected, creating space for wonder where only despair had been, reminding people that being human means more than following orders. It means feeling, creating, and daring to improvise a better future from the rubble of the past. That's what jazz taught German prisoners in camps across America during World War II. That's what jazz still teaches us today. The end.